Hello, everyone. Welcome to Dynamic Dialogue for June 23rd. Today's topic is risks in supply chain architectures, and we're going to take a look at some of the potential risks that are lurking there and give you some ways to mitigate that. This is our weekly dynamic dialogue. This is open to supply chain professionals and really anyone interested in supply chain activities. And their interest may have started before the pandemic, maybe because of the pandemic, and maybe looking forward into recovery and beyond. So we have these going through the end of June for free. After that, there's a subscription. So there's an early bird. You get 15% off if you sign up with the early bird. And time's running out for that. So I encourage you to sign up today for the subscription starting in July. You can do a monthly subscription or a quarterly subscription, and I'm going to continue these every week. So thanks for participating. I do a short presentation, and then we open it up for questions and comments. This link is good through the end of the month, which is next week. And then after that, there will be a new subscription with a new link. So today we're going to talk about architectures and risks, and I'm going to start with a little bit of a history lesson. So previously, many companies did a lot of make-buy exercises. And previously, a lot of companies did make-buy exercises. They outsourced their processes. This was quite an extensive exercise for those of you who worked in vertically integrated organizations like myself. They chose to take things outside for various different reasons. A lot of that was expensive equipment, like in printed circuit cards. Companies outsourced non-critical processes, things like cables, paint processes that they were contracting for, didn't want to have that in-house, work that wasn't used all the time, so they took things out, heat treating, things like that. They outsourced non-core competencies, things like pumps and motors that other companies did better and had as a specialty, as a core competency. And then always things like glass, ceramics, rubber, those were always good candidates for outsourcing. So there's a Deloitte survey in 2018 that showed, this was of more than 500 procurement officers, and they showed managing risk is really a top priority for more than half of those companies. Yet 65% really didn't have good supply chain transparency, and only 6% were actually leading digital transformation that could help that problem. So we outsourced a lot of things, but we lost track of what we outsourced beyond the first level. Those outsourcing decisions also drove a lot of offshoring decisions. Things like to Mexico. I was living in San Diego, and the maquiladora business became very big there. A lot of other places in Mexico. And then, of course, it went to Asia. I was working for Hewlett-Packard, and we had a lot of things going to Singapore. And then Singapore got expensive, and we went to Malaysia, and then we went to China and many different places. So all of these are an evolutionary process. The expanding markets were one reason, because there's a lot of people in China and India, well over 1 billion people in each of those countries, not to mention the rest of Asia. So the potential market there is huge. Those countries have had a big surge in their education levels. It's very competitive there to get into colleges and do different things. There are reciprocity agreements where companies want you to build things within the company. So you want to have some kind of presence in that company in order to access those markets. Some of that drove some of the decisions that led us to where we are now. And then in these countries, this increased employment level and the technical level and the good manufacturing jobs increased their discretionary income and made those markets even more attractive. So this is what's happened to kind of evolve our architectures to where they are today. In China, which is what you hear a lot about and where they think all the manufacturing is, there is a large amount of manufacturing done in China, and China is very much integrated into many supply chains, as we'll see here in a couple minutes. But you should know that all provinces in China have reported infections. All industrial centers in China have been affected. There is a labor shortage that's been there since about January, since the Chinese New Year holiday, and it's projected to go forward a little bit. If you don't know, a lot of the people that work in these industrial centers aren't from there. They come from many other of the more rural parts of China, and some of them travel very far on trains and buses to get to those industrial centers where the good jobs are. And they live there and work there, and they send money home to their families. And so it can be very difficult to get to those countries if there are travel bans. And with the quarantine restrictions, and there have been travel bans within China, and this has prevented people from going back to work. It's also been a deterrent for people to go back to work if they are afraid of the coronavirus and they're afraid of getting that and contracting it and sharing it with other people. So there's a lot of churning going on inside China right now. S&P Global experts have predicted that China's growth rate is going to fall 14% this year, from about 19% to 5%, which is a huge dip in what they've been doing. 81% of companies in the United States rely on Chinese suppliers in some way, shape, or form for some component or some part or some piece of what they do. 1 of 3 companies has major Chinese customers, and that number, of course, is trying to be even more. Many companies are looking to tap into that Chinese market. About 41% of companies have faced project delays and increased costs because of the coronavirus and because of the Chinese impact to that, because that's where prototypes were being made and production was being ramped. 1 of 5 companies worries about production stops that's working with China, and I've got to think that number is pretty low. And then this statistic is a little dated, but by the end of April, 91% of Chinese companies had resumed business. Some of those have shut down again, but at that point in time, 91% had resumed business, but only 4% were operating at full capacity. So of all of the Chinese companies that are serving all of the needs all over the world, those coming back up in the end of April, only 4% were at full capacity, which means everybody else was somewhere between still shut down and trying to ramp up, which is a huge gap. China exports a lot of things. I looked up a couple of things, and here's the top China exports. Broadcasting equipment, which has to do with TVs and computers, and it has to do with speakers and microphones, video screens, things like that. Computers are in there, office machine parts, which is anything from the printers that we use to any other kind of office machine that you might look at, faxes, all of the printers, the industrial ones, as well as the inkjet ones that you have probably in your homes. Telephones, there's a lot of telephones that are made in China. Foxconn, who does the manufacturing for Apple iPhones, that's done in China. Transformers, which are very key to a lot of the high-powered equipment that we have. Semiconductors, which are in everything electronic that's made. Video displays. And then there's a lot of other smaller things. And I found this kind of interesting. I was just commenting earlier that the weather we've had here in Southern California is beautiful. It's very mild. I had the window open earlier and had to shut the window because the kids next door were playing in the pool. But as we get into summer, we need air conditioners all over the United States. And so if you have air conditioning problems, there's a lot of transformers, there's a lot of circuits, there's a lot of semiconductor things, a lot of wires and cables and things that go into air conditioning, as well as the air conditioners themselves, that are going to be needed here in the United States. Also, valves and pumps. Now, you might not think about using those every day, but I was looking at the weather over the weekend, and we're coming into hurricane season. When we have flooding and when we have hurricanes in different parts of the country, we need valves, we need pumps, we need a lot of those kinds of things to take care of the areas that are hit and to protect the manufacturing and the homes and everything that is in those areas. So China exports things that touch us in a lot of ways. You'll hear a lot about China's trading partners. We hear a lot about with the U.S. This information shows that U.S. is a big China trading partner, but we are only 17% of what they do trade-wise. This graph is interesting because it lists Hong Kong, which is actually a part of China, but they list them separately, and they indicate that's an 11% trading partner. Then you have Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, very small, 6%, 4% respectively, and everything else is 58%. Everything else means everywhere else in the world. A lot of that is in Europe and all across Europe. Some of that is Russia. China and Russia do some trading. It can also be South America, Africa, and the other parts of Asia in smaller numbers. So China has a lot of trading partners. But this just goes to show that even something that you buy, say, from Italy, Japan, Japan, or you buy it from Europe, in Germany, the UK, it might have Chinese components in it because China trades directly with those countries as well, and they make all of those things. So what I know for sure is there is a better way to design and redesign these supply chains and identify the risk that's there before you start knee-jerking and redesigning things that maybe don't need to be redesigned. As I said before, what we have today, the supply chain architectures we have today are the result of an evolutionary process that is a result of building on decisions that were made in some cases decades ago. So given the current situation, it's not easy to reshore everything or bring everything back in-house. I hear some people say, oh yeah, my company's bringing everything back in-house, or we're bringing everything back to the US. Maybe they are, and if they are, that's okay, that's great. But in some cases, you have to say, is it really feasible or practical? You have to say, who's gonna foot the bill for that? Because anytime you move parts like that, there is a cost. Even offshoring and outsourcing cost the companies money, but the idea was that they would spend it and recoup it very quickly. But as some companies learned when they outsourced, it isn't very instantaneous. So it takes some time to do that. And if we bring things back to the United States, if we take things from company A to company B, it's still going to take some time to get that done. So these projects are processes, and they need insight, they need some research, and you need to prioritize the opportunities there. So there's a lot of things that are going on, that a lot of risks that could be there. Companies have worked with suppliers for years, building relationships, building trust, setting up a common way of working together so that it works for both companies. If you change that, if it's changed suddenly, that can be a big impact. I want everyone to understand looking for this risk is important, but if you're going to change sources, it's a big deal, and it's going to require some significant project management. So you want to look at what you really want to do and what is the risk where you are. So here's some of the risks in architecture. Companies look and see that they have too much work in one geographical location. A lot of companies have said, oh, now we realize just how dependent we are on China. Maybe not on tier 1, but on tier 2 and tier 3 parts. So they are recognizing that, and they've said they want to diversify out of China. A lot of companies have seen issues with their single and sole sources. Single sources are where you assign all of your volume to one company, even though there are competitors and competition available. Sole sources are where it's very difficult to find another source, or you may be sourcing someone that has intellectual property that you've built into your products and services. And so by definition, that is a sole source. You have to use, say, that Honeywell pump, because that's the one that's qualified in your product, and everything's been built around the use of that, the way that product functions. Companies have been very complacent with their freight modes. A lot of companies are used to now shipping things by boat from China. That takes a long time. It takes 4 to 5 weeks, and then there may be time ahead of that to get it from wherever the factory in China is to the coast to get it and then the time queued up at the dock waiting to get on the boat. And then once it hits a port here in the United States, say Long Beach or Los Angeles or any other port, then it has to be unloaded, and it may have to make another trip many goods come into Los Angeles and LA, Long Beach, and they have to go clear to the East Coast. So there's a lot of multi-mode things going on, but companies have come to just accept the way they transport goods. Some companies use a preponderance of air freight, even though that's much more expensive than boat freight. I worked for a company a few years ago. We did an analysis that showed that we were much better off putting things on a boat and trying to get them here. But after looking at and agreeing that that was a big cost saving, we didn't do it. We didn't implement that solution because of the time involved. It was much easier to put things on a plane, get them from, in this case, we were building in Malaysia and we were doing the postponement in Colorado. It was much quicker to put it on a plane and get it there and get it to our customers than being able to put it on a boat. So we were never able to implement the low-cost solution, which really was to ship between 50 and 80% of our products by boat. As you know, and are hearing about, there's trade and tariff penalties that have been increased and implemented lately. There was a new China trade agreement that is supposedly agreed to, hasn't been ratified yet, so there's some issues there. There's other treaties and other agreements that have been either put aside or Trump has threatened to throw those away and start over. So there's a lot of unknowns in that area. So that can be a potential risk for you in examining the architecture of your organization. Limited knowledge of the lower level suppliers. This is where a lot of companies have been surprised during the pandemic. They knew their supplier had this, that, and the other. So they knew their tier one supplier very well. But what they didn't know is where all of the parts that their supplier purchased from. They didn't know the sources there. And they've been learning that knowing a lot more about tier two and tier three suppliers is something that will help reduce the risk overall. So if you're going to look at risk in your supply base, then make sure you look at the key components, the non-competitive ones, again, single sources, sole sources, look at where those parts come from geographically. And I've had working with people who say, get a map, stick it on the board, stick it on the wall, and get either some magnets or some push pins and start mapping things out. Where are things made? Where do things come from? There's a lot of parts that are hard to source that need special qualification that you had to qualify at one point. If you move those or change those, you're going to have to redo all of that qualification. And if it was hard to source the first time, it's probably not going to be any easier this time. So you want to look at what parts are there, what challenges have been there before, and what's still lurking there in your supply chain. It's important to look not only at the current production, but also on whatever you have in development. Now is the opportunity for development projects where you can find alternate sources, where you can start to change the supply chain architecture. But you want to do that before you launch these products and have them into full production, because it's much more costly then. It may slow your project down a bit, but it might be worth that small time penalty to redo your architecture and remove the risk that you're trying to remove. You want to keep in mind that there's two components of risk. There's the probability of that risk occurring, and there's the impact from that risk. So I always use Southern California. The probability of earthquakes here is very high. It's 100%. We have earthquakes here. But the impact of those is relatively low. Most of the earthquakes that we have are minor and don't cause any real damage. They maybe make you pause and take a look around. I was on a Zoom meeting a couple weeks ago and there was an earthquake and I could see some things on my desk swaying and I said, yep, that's an earthquake. But most of the impact from that, luckily for us, is very small. So you want to look at your options for change. You want to look at available sources. Understand the parts that you purchase currently. Look at the risks associated with them. Look at your volumes. You may look at dual sourcing or multiple sourcing, and do your volumes really support that? In some cases, splitting your volume may drive your cost up. So is it worth it to mitigate the risk by paying a little bit more? In some cases it may be, in others it's not. And in some cases your volumes just don't support dual sourcing. I've worked in a lot of different industries, and specialized technical equipment that is used in laboratories and things, the volumes aren't high. Defense is not high volumes. So really dual sourcing is not a viable option in those cases. Then you want to look at what contracts you currently have in place. Are you locked in with suppliers for a certain amount of time or a certain amount of volume? Again, what are the requirements with the countries that you're doing business with? So we in supply chain often look at our supply base and our suppliers, but we forget to look at the customers. So this is an important area to make sure you stay in touch with the marketing people, understand what the customer requirements are for your suppliers, so that you don't move suppliers out of an area and then find out that you impacted your ability to sell into that area because you changed the volume. You want to look, one thing companies don't do enough, I think, is work with the suppliers they have and ask about alternate source locations. Do they have capabilities in multiple locations where your suppliers, your current suppliers, could help you diversify? They could help you move from one location to another. So find out what capabilities your companies have, your suppliers have, and what they can do to help you change some of these things around. Once you identify the risk, the supplier can take some responsibility with that. They can help you resolve that and mitigate that. You need to be aware that if you move things from low-cost areas, if you have a high labor content, it could impact your cost considerably. So you need to take that into account and understand what happens there. But it's also an opportunity to help improve areas like social responsibility. If you have initiatives for social responsibility increases, small business and diversified supply bases, if you're trying to implement more sustainability initiatives, looking at where you can't do that today may be an opportunity for you to increase and support those initiatives while you mitigate some other risks. So you want to be able to look for the opportunity as well as the risk and the challenge. It's important that you have labor models and cost models, and you understand the difference between what is and what could be somewhere else, so that you aren't surprised. And these include freight models and inventory models, because owning that inventory while it's on the ocean can really increase your inventory balances. And if you're not doing that, then that can be another win in another area. And make sure if you're going to move from one area to another that you've done the market analysis in that targeted location, so that you know where you're going and you know what challenges await you there. Because no place is risk-free, and you want to make sure you don't just run from one challenge straight into another one. It's also important to ramp a second supplier while you have your first supplier continuing to provide parts, if that's at all possible, because that really helps you manage that transition. So there's some benefits and some impact if you make some changes to your supply base. Once you identify the risks that are there, then you want to make sure that you look for the benefits and the challenges. So if you have risk, or if you perceive risk from having too much in Asia, you can reduce that risk by diversifying. You can move things all over the world. You can bring things back to the United States. You can take things to Mexico or to Central America, South America for that matter. You can take things to other parts of Asia, and you can take things to Eastern Europe for low-cost areas and different parts of Europe for regular manufacturing. You want to be able to shorten your lead times if possible. Lead times have lengthened recently, 200%, 220%. I've seen lead times quoted as increasing within China. So that's a potential benefit, that you can shorten your lead times, especially if you're buying from Asia and you have a lot of product on the water, where those lead times include that extra 5 to probably 6-7 weeks for manufacture in China and then getting onto the ship and transported here. 5 to 8 weeks is not uncommon for that, just for that portion. You can reduce your inventory balances, as I said before. You can improve the quality. If you're not happy with the quality, moving things, changing your architecture is an opportunity to improve your quality. Bad quality, poor quality is a risk that you have maybe inherent in your supply chain. Changing things around can help you to mitigate that risk. And again, you can avoid some tariffs, or you can avoid the threat of tariffs that could be coming up. There are potential challenges with changing the architecture. One thing is, again, you have to understand high labor content work, because if you move it from place to place, you're going to get impacted by the change in wages if there are any. So you want to make sure you know what those wages are, where you are, and then what they are, how much they are, where you're going. Quality, again, you can improve quality, but you can make your quality much worse too. So new suppliers have a learning curve, and they're going to have to learn the new products, the new processes. They're going to have to get up to speed, and that can impact your own internal quality for some time. You can have a long qualification time for a new supplier, a different supplier. You need to expect a reasonable amount of time and probably add 10 or 20% to that, whatever you think it is, and add some cushion there. And sometimes it takes much longer than anticipated to qualify a new supplier for any number of reasons. You're probably going to change your supply base quantity. You're probably going to grow your suppliers. So if you have a big initiative that says you're trying to shrink and consolidate your supply base, then changing things around is going to be anti-achievement of that goal. So you want to make sure that you look at those current initiatives. You can have unit price increases, but lower total cost. And depending on how your goals are set, this may be a good thing to do, but if it contradicts the goal you have, it may not be the way the solution that you choose. For example, moving things from Asia to Mexico, you can have a slight price increase, but you may be able to reduce the inventory you have, the freight time you have, the freight cost that you have. You may be able to change a lot of things about your total cost, but if you're an organization that looks at the unit price cost solely or primarily when you're looking at cost reductions, that small increase, if your volume is high, may not be a good thing and may be counter to what your organization wants to do. So look at your goals, and you may have to change your goals, or you may have to consider those in the solutions that you choose. Keep in mind that knee-jerk decisions, making a decision quickly and saying we need to get out of China, may not be the best thing to do. It may be the right answer, but what actually gets moved, when it gets moved, how it gets moved, where it gets moved to, the more time you take and the more deliberate your decision is, the less you're going to have to revisit that, modify that, or the less it will cost you in the long run. One thing you need to keep in mind is you have continued priorities while you look for these risks in your architecture, while you look for solutions and alternatives to that. Your priorities have to be to look at the goals and objectives that you set in January. This is where I counsel a lot of people, is to say you need to readjust those goals. You need to review those goals and adjust them if necessary. If your goals that were set in late last year or the beginning of this calendar year are no longer apply, are no longer SMART goals, which means they may not be as relevant, or they may not be as timely, or they may not be as achievable, then you have to adjust those. Supply chains need a lot more flexibility and agility. So if your supply chain doesn't have that now, you want to figure out how you can do that without completely disassembling and reassembling the architecture in a way that you're not sure is going to give you that flexibility that you require. Assurance of supply has to be attended to as you look for these risks and as you try to mitigate the risks and eliminate what you can. So you have to make sure someone, somewhere, enough people, enough resources are dedicated to assuring that you have supply coming in as you need it and meeting the requirements that your customers have in the short run. Risk is highly correlated to performance variation. So if you're seeing performance variations in your supply base during COVID, now that you're moving into recovery, hopefully, or if you're not moving in there, if you're anticipating that, still look for the performance variations. Who's performed better or worse in the last 3 months, March, April, May, than they have in the 6 months prior to that. Understand what has changed and understand why. Supply chain architecture changes can really help remove risk, but they need to be well thought out and risk-based decisions. So making those decisions has to be carefully done. They require some time and oversight, and it requires some time to implement that and to put that solution in place. It is not going to happen in the next 2 to 3 months typically, and it may take longer than that. So depending on your fiscal year and your goals, you may have to adjust those accordingly. You want to make sure that you make adjustments with some cushion built into your supply and into your schedule, because your supply and your schedule are linked very closely, and if your schedule for the transition extends, you may run out of supply. It would be better to have excess inventory for a small amount of time than to run out of supply and not be able to satisfy your customer requirements. Change for the sake of change never yields optimal solutions, so make sure you have the right rationale and the right goals in mind for making changes. And any kind of change to your architecture requires cross-functional team and organizational support, starting with the highest levels of senior management. So the flexibility and agility, that's how fast you can change your volume and your mix, keeping that consistent flow of goods coming. So potential risks there are around your lead time. Your lead time can increase. You can have shortages or surplus of material. If you try to get more flexibility, you still have the trade and tariff issues that you're trying to do, so that can impact you depending on how you're shipping. And you can have some geographical clumping based on that. So if you're trying to put things together in a close proximity, then you might end up, again, trying to be flexible and agile with your supply base. You may have too much in one geographical area. So you want to look at your forecast for the next 3 to 12 months, share those with your suppliers, make sure they understand and they're working with you and reacting as you decide together. This should be a collaborative thing. You have to adjust the lead times in your system. When I say I've seen data that says lead times here in the United States have increased 200%, that means you need to change your MRP, ERP, your spreadsheet to allow for those increased lead times. If you don't, then you're going to be short of parts. You're not going to be ordering on time. You're going to be expediting, and you're going to be costing a lot more money. So one thing you should do very quickly is to validate your lead times with your suppliers and update as necessary. Inventory levels, again, if you need to move things around, you want to make sure you have enough inventory in the pipeline. That can be inventory in finished goods. That can be inventory in raw material at your facility or with your company who's the customer. But it also means you want to work with your tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 suppliers, because they can help with inventory as well. If you have a tier 2 supplier that's supplying your current supplier, but you also want your new supplier to buy from them, then you need to reach out to that tier 2 supplier, make sure they understand what you're doing, make sure they understand that they may get dual signals on forecast for some period of time, but then it's going to level back off. What you don't want is to surprise a tier 2 or tier 3 supplier, them expecting that the volume goes up and is going to stay up, and then they're hit by the negative piece when you get back to moving from supplier A to supplier B. You need to make sure you understand how you can manage that. While you're moving suppliers from either supplier A to supplier B or one location to another, it's very hard to incorporate change orders. if you have design changes, if you have significant reschedules, it can be very difficult to do. So you want to make sure that you set your own protocols for putting those changes in place so that everyone on your team is working with that. If you have to have a design change, then you should cut it in. But if it can wait, then it probably needs to wait, or maybe gets cut in with the new supplier and let the old supplier continue with the old design. It's important that you communicate with your internal partners, your production functions, the logistics department, the quality departments, all of those, and making sure that you're all talking about these changes so that everyone is on the same page with what you're doing. Assurance of supply has its own set of risks. Again, potential risks, the freight modes that you are used to using can be greatly slowed, so therefore increasing your lead time. Things like putting things on the water when the ship time is the same, but getting it onto that ship and getting it to the port and getting it from the port to the final destination can be greatly extended nowadays. And if you're going to start air freighting a lot of things, then you're going to increase your cost. So you need to understand what's going on with that. You can have a lot of miscommunications and misunderstandings. So it's important to over communicate and to clarify and make not do one way communication that I told you this, make sure that you hear back from them. This is what I heard, this is what I'm going to do, and yes, this correlates to our plan and what we're doing together. Understand who's got how much of finished goods, raw materials, all through the supply chain. You want to look for shortages. You also want to look for surpluses. And then make sure your supplier's recovery schedule, coming back up to speed at full capacity, is in alignment with yours. If they are very far behind your company, you're going to have a problem. So that might be another reason you need to bring on a supplier more quickly than you thought, because your current supplier can't recover as quickly for whatever reasons, depending on where they are, depending on their workforce, depending on any number of things. And then you may have suppliers that are out of business, which may require you to find new suppliers more quickly and more of a knee-jerk reaction. Still, even if you have that situation, you want to try to not do the knee-jerk reaction, but actually find out how you can help your whole supply chain architecture when you replace that supplier that is no longer in business. And maybe you have to do something quickly, but you can do something that's a very short-term solution, and then while you figure out your longer-term solution. So with freight, you can work with brokers, you can work with the 3PLs, you can work with logistics professionals to help you manage the changes in freight, manage the rates, and make sure that you get things to where they need to be without breaking the bank. Again, you cannot communicate too much. You just have to keep reiterating and clarifying and making sure, because things do change from week to week. Look at the inventory across the supply chain. You may need to increase that if you're changing your architecture and moving from one location to another or one supplier to another. That might freak the finance guys out, but you need to tell them that that's a short-term solution and it will eventually work itself out. Allow ample time for any transitions that you decide to do, because these probably will take longer than you anticipate. So make your best estimate, and my suggestion is to add 20% to the schedule, because you're going to need some time. And then make sure you have resources internally to support that. That means technical resources, that means quality resources, that means warehouse resources, logistics people, freight people. The production people understand what's happening, that they may get a part that doesn't have the same markings on it or looks slightly different, so that they're not surprised and reject something just because it's not in the same package that it was in before. So the pandemic has exposed a lot of risk. It's masked certain risk. It's also mitigated other risks that you thought about. So if you had shortages and you slowed down, maybe that solved your shortage problem because your production rates slowed. So don't get fooled by things from the pandemic. Look at the real root cause, look at the real situation, not only now, but where you need to be in 3 months, 6 months, next year. coronavirus has really suggested to a lot of organizations that they need to look at their architecture, their supply chain architecture, and maybe there are changes that can be made or should be made or need to be made. So explore those, make sure you explore options with that, and don't make quick decisions. There's not a lot of right or wrong answers at this point because every organization is unique. So you have to make a decision based on your particular company, on your situation, based on your suppliers, based on your customers, based on your core competencies, so many factors. Advising your suppliers of what you're doing, that is something that you need to do. But again, that's going to vary from supplier to supplier. That's going to vary from company to company. In some cases, you need to tell the supplier, hey, we are moving to another supplier. We've had to change our architecture, and our business with you is going to change. It can be changing, it can be going away, it can be whatever. You want to make sure you understand what that will do to the supplier, because if you tell them too quickly and they're not happy about it, you might impact your supply base. If you don't tell them very quickly and they find out about it another way, that can impact your relationship and impact their performance. And don't forget that new sources bring new risks because you don't know what you don't know. So no supplier is perfect. No solution is perfect. There's always risk that you're changing anything adds risk to that. Understand as much as you can about what those risks are and how you can manage those. Supplier volume changes, again, if you're going from a single source to a dual source, if you take a supplier's volume down to 50% or even down 40%, that can have a big impact on them, especially now in this pandemic aftermath or during the pandemic. Small businesses may not be able to handle a huge reduction in their volume. It may impact the viability of their financials. It may be something that they can't handle. So you want to make sure that you examine that and think about what the impact can be to the supplier before you decide to, oh yeah, we're just going to drop your volume 40%, because that may make them non-viable for the future. Ramp time for suppliers is going to vary. You might have a new supplier that comes up very quickly, and you might have another one that comes up very slowly. So you have to prepare for that, allow for that, monitor that, and be prepared to help the suppliers as they new suppliers as they ramp up to your production rates. Qualification requirements vary by part, by company, by industry. So understand that. With travel restrictions still in place and travel slowed, people reluctant to travel, it may be that you have difficulty qualifying something because traditionally you just sent people there to do a first article inspection, buy off the process, buy off the parts, and go. If you can't do that now, you've got to figure out alternate ways to do that and how you're going to do that and how much time that's going to take, because that's going to impact your ability to get your supplier not only launched, but ramped up to your production level. These architecture changes, they have both cost and benefit involved. They do cost money. How that benefits you in the long run is your job to analyze and ascertain and figure out what's best for your organization. And don't launch these changes before you have buy-in from your internal stakeholders. It's very important that you as an organization are all doing something together. And in my experience, you want to make sure that your stakeholders and your internal partners know what you've communicated to the current supplier about what's going on. I've had situations where my supplier found out from another member of the team that we were either changing a part or obsoleting a part or changing a supplier, and that doesn't bode well for the supply chain organization when they find out from the design engineer that you've made a change internally and just haven't communicated that clearly to the supplier yet. So risk-based decision-making really delivers better solutions, and we're going to talk about that next week. So if you want to change the results, you've got to change the questions. If you ask the same questions you were asking pre-COVID, then you're probably not addressing all of those areas. So if you want better results, if you want less risk in your supply chain, make sure you change the questions, add to the questions, ask more, ask different, but don't expect the same perspective to yield the same kind of results. So that's our dynamic dialogue for today. Next week, I think I said in some that we were going to have a guest speaker, but I've changed that. We're going to talk about risk-based decision making. So I think this is an important concept. It goes along with a lot of the things I've been talking about the last few weeks. So this is a VUCA world that we live in, which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and a lot of ambiguity. So this is a term that we're all becoming more familiar with, even if you've never heard that acronym before. I think you're feeling all of that volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. We're going to talk about the principles of risk-based decision-making. I'm going to show you a framework for that and a process. And so that's what we're going to do. Again, this is dynamic dialogue. If you want to continue with these, please subscribe to our webinar series that starts July 7th with the first one. That is going to be on a subscription basis. So all of this will be still available to you if you subscribe. If not, then it will have limited availability to you. You'll have to either purchase the recording that you want, the slides that you want, and it's a lot easier to just subscribe. And if you do it now, you can get an early bird. If you put the word early bird, all one word, in, you'll get a 15% discount. If you want further discussion about any of these topics, you can set up a 30-minute call with me for free. It's www.callwithjane.com. We'll talk about how Purple Link can help your business, because there is a better way to reduce cost and risk than many of the traditional ways. So sign up for those. I have a course coming up, a workshop on supply chain data analytics that's going to start the week of July 13th. So you can enroll on the website for that. And we're doing CPSM prep classes, so those are ongoing. And that's going to be, we're doing exam 2. We're going to start exam 3 in August. If you'd like to get a CPSM, there are 3 exams. There is no required order for those 3 exams. You can take any one of those first. So if I'm doing exam 3 and you want to take that, you can take that exam first, and then exam 1 and 2 in whatever order you feel like that works for you. So that's our dynamic dialogue for today. I'm going to stop recording and I'm going to take some comments and questions.